Okay, great. So I'm not entirely sure how my presentation will fit into this, but let's see. Um, it's titled Remarks on the Politics of Citizen Bioscience. And I should perhaps very briefly say the background of my research. So we are part of the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And here, our department, so to say, is the Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis, ITAS. And technology assessment has in the last, say, 20 years developed very much in the direction of also looking very broadly at ethical, legal, and societal issues. And in this context, the notion of and the concept of responsible research innovation is very important to us. And we have really a lot of projects, had a lot of projects in this field, including one, for example, that I will to refer to later, called Synergene, which ran from 2013 to 2017 and was a project, a huge dialogue project, a stakeholder and public dialogue project on synthetic biology. So my political background is political science, but in our institute, we are working strongly interdisciplinary. We're doing strongly interdisciplinary work. So we have natural scientists, engineers, social scientists, and humanities scholars. And I want to make a kind of proposal, perhaps on a little bit, for many of you, on a little bit abstract and almost philosophical level. But let's see if you're interested in it and if it's useful for the discussion. And I focus on something called citizen bioscience. There are other words for it, like you might even know the more notorious and more controversial notions such as biohackers, or also not so controversial do-it-yourself biologists. And I will look at this very particular kind of citizen science that has played quite a role in the discussions on synthetic biology, and where a lot of things are going on. And COVID is not in my talk at all, but I should mention that some of them do also this kind of grassroots science and research, also in countries with where the infrastructure in science and technology is not so advanced as, for example, in Europe. And sometimes these activities can be very useful for also in the health context. Okay, this was the introduction, and you see it's a lot of text. I don't expect you to read all this, but in particular, you know the definitions of RRI, so I will not repeat them. I have one of René von Schomberg, and on the other end, the Rome Declaration on RRI. And I would argue that these notion of RRI, or the discourse on RRI, has a very strong flavor of the thinking of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, who has argued that in moral discussions, rationality is, so to say, key. In ideal circumstances, a consensus can be reached, and which is the basis for a moral norm. So the idea is that by discussing and bringing people together, you will come to a kind of agreement, and perhaps even to a kind of basis for common action. So I think much of what we heard today is based, of course, on this, and as is many of our liberal democratic political thinking, and much of the thinking behind international cooperation is based on such ideas. And according to him, there are, however, certain preconditions to come to a rational discussion. So it should be a kind of power-free communication, or at least ideal to have a power-free communication. No discussion should have a dominating role based on anything other than the strongest argument. All participants can address arguments and problems. No one is beforehand excluded from the discussion. And you all know how important the notion of inclusion is in all the concept and in all the activities around responsible research innovation. And we heard in the talk immediately before how important it is also to include not only, as so often in Europe is the case, not only the middle classes, the educated middle classes, but really the entire population, because science communication is so important. And of course, another precondition is that all participants truly want to engage in the discussion. And here we recently see a lot of problems, because it seems to be that large parts of many populations, many countries of the world are not even willing to have an rational discussion anymore, but see themselves in a kind of information warfare. So there is not even the hope to discuss. But I don't want to go on these actual problems too much, but talk too much about this kind of very deep crisis that I, to some extent, see in political communication, thereby also in public science communication. But want to point out that Habermas is, of course, not believing that this can be, so to say, this is just an ideal to some extent, a regulatory ideal where you try to orient towards in order to have a better and more rational kind of societal discourse. So he acknowledged that to assume the existence of these preconditions is quite unrealistic, but he argues that the discussants will simply disengage whenever they think that the preconditions are not given, or they stay only in for tactical reasons. Okay, the critics of this are largely, I would say, often inspired by the late French philosopher Michel Foucault. And they argue that these Habermasian notions of our responsible research and innovation are too naive. Discourses, in their point of view, are constituted by mechanism of exclusion, which are in turn often justified by means of claims of superior or even exclusive rationality of certain actors, for example, experts. The mechanisms of exclusion determine what knowledge is seen as legitimate. And here I have a quote of one SDS researcher who argues in this vein, where the politics and responsible innovation. So he says, okay, this is a discourse which ignores power structures. And he says, and even definitely emphasizes that relations of power cannot be dissolved in communication. Participants should be allowed to discuss about and engage in games of power as a means of channeling and regulating it. So, and this is something where I, to some extent, agree that we have a lot of, in German, we would say a high tone, like we a lot of ideals and something, and often, as political scientists, I would say, often based of assumptions that are perhaps not naive, but a little bit too idealistic. And so, what we did in the SynEnergy project and in other projects is we developed a kind of mixed strategy. And this was to encourage the different stakeholder groups and also the citizens to conduct activities or engage in discussions in a kind of Foucauldian vein. This means we allowed, for example, in SynEnergy project, we had a lot of problems with this, with stakeholders who were really angry about this. We allowed all groups, and there were a lot of very, very emotional discussions about green biotech, which you know is a very controversial issue, in particular in some European countries. And we allowed all of them to use, so to say, not so to say, but to use European taxpayers' money to also plan their engagement in the discussions, even exclusively. And we said this is okay. And we also looked at this in a kind of looking at the power structures and really helped all the engaged, all the stakeholder groups, and this was a large project, all the stakeholder groups to bring in their positions, and but only if they would also then on the basis of this participate in a kind of Habermasian style multi-stakeholder events and discussions. So this was a kind of mixed strategy. And I don't want to discuss now with all these, this was really a fascinating project, in particular for me as a political scientist. I just want to mention a few things that show the, so to say, the power structure or the structure in this field. With relation to this very specific topic of citizen bioscientists or biohackers, and there are other words for them. And this was for me quite fascinating and strange, because when the project started, was online. As soon as the project was online, SynEnergy, I had an email by a very friendly email by an FBI agent in my mailbox, which was rather unusual for my kinds of project. And this was something which signaled very early to me that obviously the biosafety and the biosecurity concerns in particular are really key in this discussion about the citizen bioscientists. And of course, the regulations are different, what you're allowed to do, for example, in the US or in Europe. And much of this was in the beginning dominated by a discussion of fear, to say. But this was always to some way balanced by the notion that this kind of citizen science is absolutely fascinating. It has clearly the ethos and the hopes of open innovation in it. And so it was a really interesting discussion to see how to bring these different perspectives and, in fact, the players together. And this also brought us to the question, what could be good for our forums for deliberating on the status of biohacking practitioners in all kinds of fields. And here we often had the impression that security and safety concerns were just a kind of excuse for traditional players, in particular at the universities, to exclude them, to say, okay, no, we don't want them. Of course, I understood many researchers, of course, at the university were afraid of possible negative impacts of these activities on their image of their research fields, which to some extent, in particular in countries like Germany and Austria, is already very controversial. Or I think everything around genetic modification. But on the other hand, one could really clearly see that it was also some kind of like, we are the experts, and we don't want these people to do things in citizen labs or in some, and then at the same time, many universities, like I live in Heidelberg, I work in Karlsruhe, but I live in Heidelberg. And for example, in Heidelberg for a long time now, we have a lab, a fab lab, which includes a lab of do-it-yourself biologists. So again, here a kind of cultural changes where to some extent the ideal of open innovation is to some extent for a while hindered by kind of political conflicts and political concerns, and sometimes also simply by how do you say, traditional ways of thinking. On the other hand, I've also seen that not only the critics to some extent, but also within the hacking communities, there was not so much willingness by many of them, because often these are only young people who just want to, they do this for fun. They're hanging around doing experiments and drinking some soft drinks or something, hanging around and doing science, and they often feel a little bit overwhelmed by the interest in them, and they don't want to, often they don't have the time, or they're not so much interested in really looking at the societal aspects around this. So this is something where if we believe that these kind of things are not only uninteresting niche activities, it's the question, on the one hand, how can we overcome these kind of traditional notions that they are irrelevant or even dangerous, but at the same time also within these groups, how can we help these people to also better understand their own role in this innovation system and engaged with us? Because often, and this is something which I would really like to emphasize, is there's a risk of a kind of precarious work in bioscience, because often these people, at least for a while, they were really fascinated, everyone was fascinated by them, and they were often invited to be engaged in all kinds of RRI and public dialogue activities, but often then as underpaid freelancers, or not even paid at all. And much of these activities were then, so to say, monopolized again by the universities or by the science communication specialists. And we again had some power structures where I would say much of the original fresh air, as we would say in German, fresh air that came into through these movements were to some extent was away because of kind of traditional thinking dominating the field again. And I will skip the next point, or just point out that perhaps you'd like to read some of his works. It's a mid 20th century very interesting researcher called Edgar Zilse, and he had this idea that modern science is based on tinkering originally, and non-academic tinkering. And maybe you would like to have a look and look this up. Basically, one could argue that some optimists who really emphasize the importance of these areas, they would say it's a kind of return of the tinkerer. And here the question is, the overarching question in a RRI context, and not only public funding, but also say philanthropic or interested industry funding, where, for example, industry in Germany at least often now supports fab labs directly, but this is not so much the case yet in biosciences. But here's the question is, how can these kind of movements be integrated without becoming unoriginal, and how can these kind of activities be funded? And as a last point, often I have here of two people who are in our field very important, Swister and Rip. They argue that deliberation activities in the sense of the classical Athenian Agora, the marketplace, is this idea of discussion about, so to say, the Habermasian way, like you discuss about good arguments. And then, of course, you could have the model of arena where you fight, some win and others lose. This would be the model Foucauldian. And I would argue, let us, so to say, a proposal to see it differently. Let's see for the theater, to make other Greek reference. Um, because here, theater as a metaphor for art more broadly, art also already plays an important role in these biohacking, citizens, and bioscience activities. There are a lot of overlaps, and most of you, I think, will be familiar with bioart, where people use with the same problems that biohackers have in terms of acceptance and safety issues and security concerns. They use methods and tools of modern biology for artistic purposes. I don't talk too much about it because I guess most in this round will know about this. And I would make the proposal for the discussion is that the role of bioart, mainly as artistic research, because there's this tendencies for decades now that artists see themselves as researchers, define their stuff, what they're doing as research, and in fact often do all kinds of different research, social science research, but also natural scientific research to some extent. And kind of a little bit of self-advertising, you might look at the current issue of Nanoethics, which is a journal of Springer Journal, which I'm editing. And in the current issue of Nanoethics, we have some very interesting examples of such artistic research. And my proposal would be, I called it the theater proposal, would be to further strengthen the role of art in responsible research innovation in the biosciences. And my last slide is, I want to justify this, so to say, politically and philosophically, again, referring to Habermas, because he distinguishes between the domains of the instrumental, the moral practical, and the aesthetic. And there are different kind of claims. One is about cognitive truth, that's, so to say, what science is, normative rightness, the political thing, and never mix this up. So you can never prove something, even if it's scientifically sound, you cannot convince the population that they are stupid, and this is the deficit model. So political process is always different. So people can believe in the sanctity of nature and say, no, we don't like these modern biosciences. And politically speaking, that is totally okay to say this. It cannot be forbidden in a democracy to have used such arguments, but it's a different sphere. Habermas will argue, and the same for the aesthetic, for art, where subjective expressiveness is the key term. And in his view, communicative action based on normative reason is crucial for democratic social interaction. So this is really the basis of our political system, and aesthetic works and arts should not get mixed up with this and cannot coordinate actions like this. This is to some extent a very German point of view, because many people would argue that fascism or National Socialism in particular really built on a kind of mix using emotions and art and aesthetic aestheticization of politics in a very bad way. But what about artistic activities on the basis of an understanding of art as a cultural domain with its own logic, different from, for example, can we do something in our context with this? Again, according to Habermas here, aesthetic experience can permit our cognitive significations, our normative expectations, which should mean that to some extent, of course, when we are doing, he's not saying, okay, these are totally different things. Of course, he knows in human interaction, these dimensions are interrelated. And in particular, and this I want to point out as my last point, is they change two things. They change the manner in which we refer to one another. It is often, and I've seen this very practically, if we talk, for example, the biofiction film festivals, these of biofaction, I often work with them. If we people, some experts from different fields, stakeholders with often conflicting interests, and the public watch together a number of films on this topic, where things are seen on this aesthetic level, they often find different ways of interacting when to the kind of competitive discussion. And the second thing is, and this maybe sounds a little bit romantic, or I don't know, but of course, art also renews for us, if we are impressed on an emotional level, renews for us interpretations of what we hope for. And this, of course, is entirely political, and this is all about, in responsible research innovation, the question is, what are our needs? And our needs are not only material, and what we need, for example, in light of such a crisis at the moment, but it's also something about how we understand, and if we feel safe in the development science, or we hope for science. And this we can only do to some extent if it also relates to of us as a kind of whole human beings, which also have an aesthetic dimension. So as a conclusion, art is a domain on its own, but via its public reception and interdisciplinary and transprofessional thematization, so that many people, like I said before, use science as an opportunity to think about, use art as an opportunity to think about science, can thereby significantly contribute to normative cognitive action in the biosciences, and thus to the social shaping of this field. I didn't look at the time. I hope it worked and it fitted to the context, and I look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much for the attention.